Hello everybody. In today's episode we will be disassembling and reassembling the Kodak Instamatic 100 camera and showing you how everything works so you can diagnose your own problems with this camera. So as you see here, my camera has a flash bulb mounted in. To put the bulb in and take it out, you have to press this silver button here, this spring, and when you press it, the jaws open up wider so you can take it out of its socket. As you see inside there, when you're pressing it, the jaws inside move. So let's put this aside. So the first thing we should do is open up the back cover. Open up the back with this latch here. And the first two screws we're going to remove for today are these two screws right there, 1 and 2. So let's get to it. This is a good tool to have to get all the screws or tiny parts out. After those two screws are taken out, you can just lift the back cover out from its socket. You could put the two screws back in so you know that they belong together. The next screws we will take out today are the screws from the frame. That would be screw number 1 from one side of the camera, screw number 2 from the bottom of the camera, screw number 3 from the side of the camera. And of course, as you see, the screw from the bottom is longer, so you should remember that the longer screw goes into the bottom part of the camera. And there's also a fourth screw to take out. It's right inside there on the bottom part under the opening, the lens opening. Right there on the very bottom part. You gotta unscrew it under an angle, so that's why it can be sometimes a bit tougher, but there we go. And it's also a longer screw. Now, having them screws out, you can, with your thumbs, well, with your one finger on here where you have the winding lever, and on the opposite side, on the top frame here, you can hold on and take the front cover off. If you don't take it off that way, you might end up with your battery door cover running away, so you just gotta keep track of that. At this point, it's good to find out how your button works here for the flash release. You can clean your lenses and the view lenses. So let's put this aside. Also, another thing that could fall out when you're taking it apart is your flash housing. As you see, it's nothing complicated. It just goes in through the top. It goes in through the top like this. While we are here, we can see how the shutter works. When you wind your camera, of course after you wind it, you can't release the shutter yet. You have to trip the sprocket lock here in the back. After that, you could release the shutter. And here we can also see the mechanism, how the two shutter speeds work. This camera has two shutter speeds. It has 1/90th of a second, the regular shutter speed, and 1/40th of a second when the flash is taken out of popped out. You can see here how the shutter speed mechanism works. It's a very simple mechanism. When the shutter is fired, you can see here it has a little lock, but when it's fired with the flash taken out, it takes a wide swing and comes back. It makes a long distance, but when that's 1/40th of a second. But when the flash is hidden inside, you can see it presses this spring here. Let's take it out. It presses this spring here. You see by the shutter here. That makes it get very close to the shutter mechanism. At that point, when the flash is hidden, when the shutter fires, this lock here hits this spring, and the spring helps it close much faster. That's 1/90th of a second there, because it takes it much faster to close. It hits the spring, and the spring forces it faster back into its place. So when the flash is out, this spring should be away, so the shutter can open further out, and it takes it a longer time to close. When the flash is inside, the spring comes up to the shutter, and the shutter hits the spring, making it close much sooner than before. So now, also between here we got the flash contact. When you see when the flash is hidden, the flash doesn't connect with the flash bulb contact with the batteries, but when it's out, there's a metal part here. This metal part here connects with this battery contact here, the flash contact. When the shutter is pressed, it connects with the batteries, firing the flash bulb. So now let's take it apart further. In order to take it apart further, we have to take off this aluminum part up here. The best way to do it is get a very thin, flat screwdriver, because we need to put it in between the aluminum part and the plastic and pry it up. I have done this many times before, so mine isn't glued. Yours will most likely be glued together, but the glue shouldn't be holding too hard together. You should have an easy time of taking it apart. And up here we see the two screws that we need to take out. As you see, the two screws are longer screws as well. So you keep all those parts together so you know what goes together. After we got those two screws taken out, you got to be careful, because if you separate it, this viewing window here, the glass part, will not be secured in place, so you can lose it. Just lift it straight up, and underneath you can find the center viewing lens right here. If at any time you need to clean it, you just lift this side up and the other side up. Be careful not to bend it too much out of space, and you can take out your viewing lens. You can use a flat screwdriver or anything to put under the lens here and pry it out slowly. It will be most likely glued in place, so just do it very carefully and slowly. There we go, and it comes out, and you should have a protected tip or something, but I don't really care about this. It's my experimental camera, so you can clean it up and put it back into the same spot it came out of. It can be a tight fit, so just be careful not to scratch it or damage your lens here. And then you reinstall these covers here. Yes, of course, if you bent it a little bit, it's going to be a little harder fit. Got to put them perfectly in their slots. There, just like that. So let's put this aside. And now, and we still, so you don't forget, this glass from the screen up front here. That also comes out. This should come out very easily. Let's just put it aside, clean it also. So now we can see more of the assembly at work. We can wind the lever, the sprocket lock, engage that, and we can see more of the mechanism at work. So here we got the wind lever spring that helps the wind lever come back into its place. We got the wind lever itself. We got the main lever back down here, what engages with the shutter. And we got the wind lever blocking lug, so it don't come back further than it's supposed to, and so it doesn't wind further than it should. And we got the release lever itself. So as you see, when we cock the winding lever, the main lever jumps over this lock here, falls into place behind it, and when we fire the shutter, we actually hide this lock, so the main lever flies and hits the shutter here by this lock part, and it moves the shutter. Now the reason why you have to kick this sprocket lock or sprocket lever, when you cock the mechanism, you can't fire it until you trip this, because as you see under here, in this spot, in this hole under the release lever, it's physically blocked. And when you look closely, when you hit the sprocket lever, oops, don't want parts flying, you can see that the bottom here, the lock went down, and now you can press it. After you press it, the lock comes back up and you can't press it again. We'll look into that further when we disassemble this mechanism further. So inside here, we can see the lower ratchet gear. This is the main wind gear, and this is the upper ratchet gear sitting right on top here. And this is the ratchet lever. And underneath here, we got the film driver. And when you notice, when the doors are closed, the driver goes down to engage with the cartridge. But when you open the doors, the driver goes higher so we can take out the cartridge easier. You put it down, pressing on this. When the door closes, it presses here into this hole to release the lock. And when you open it up with the lever, it goes back up. So let's disassemble this further. So what we do here, we pull the spring this way to release it from this stud. And we pull it up and it should separate from the winding lever from this hole here. We put it aside. So now it goes back and forth constantly. We take out these two screws. And now when you take out these two screws, we got here two spots, this and this, two studs. Those two studs are locating or aligning studs that help the mechanism align on its spot here. Now after we took out the screws, it is best to wind the winding lever, because it will release the stuff here from the main lever here. And when we're going to be putting it back together, you have to remember that it has to be in the winded position also, so everything could fit perfectly without no worries. So how to take the plate off? We have to lift this plate from these aligning studs, just a little bit of lift with your thumb. Well, I released my spring, because when you're lifting it, the lock gets further in. So now when it's off the studs, you just delicately maneuver it. We got to also take this spring out of the way here. And sometimes there we go. After some maneuvering, it should release. And as always for me, this mechanism inside here falls apart, but no worry about that. We will get back to this in a second. If yours fell apart, don't worry, it's very simple to correct. And inside here we see how everything on this side works. So we got the winding lever, and since we don't got the sprocket, this sprocket indicator or lock, however you want to call it, in here, we don't have the lock. So we can fire the shutter as many times as we want without the lock. But we have to be careful because the main lever might go a little bit too far out. It should stop on this battery connector. If we press in the shutter release too hard, you see it will jump further and you can't lock it anymore. It will be out of reach. So what we have to do, with the shutter pressed in, the shutter release pressed in, just get this back behind the locking lever here. And you might have to release some things here for this to work, because it has to find its place behind the main spring here now. So it can be a little tough. There we go. We have to put it in all the way back position and then put it back in place. There we go. And now we can cock it all over again. And just don't press the shutter too hard so the battery connector doesn't hide completely. Just delicately, and you can fire it. So that's one problem you can solve if you press it too hard. Like now, you just, with the winding lever all the way returned, just press the release shutter all over again, and you could push this side in order to be aligned back with this part over here. And now you can cock it all over again and delicately press it, and it works just like that. This is the drive spring over here, and this is the drive itself. And here you can see easier how the lift mechanism works. When you close the doors, it drops lower in order to engage with the cartridge. And when you open the doors using the door opening here, it lifts the entire mechanism up in order to take the cartridge out much easier. So now let's get back to this part where our mechanism fell apart. So let's clean it up a bit, take all the pieces out. There we go. We're not going to be taking out the sprocket lever itself. It's not easy to take it out, so we don't want any problem putting it back in. So just make sure the sprocket lever is on its stud over here. And the sprocket lever spring, it's this very straight one with the U-shaped end. And that U-shaped end goes in with the very short end over here. It has to go into a hole right over here in the corner, in this corner over here. So you just put it in just like that, and holding the sprocket lever so it doesn't fall off of its stud, we take this long end and we put it against this lock over here. So we just wind it up just like that. So you see now when we move it, just hold on to it on the stud here, it falls back into its place. So that's on properly. Next, we got the release lock, release lever lock. When this is engaged and it's locking the release lever, this long arm over here is physically under the release lever, preventing it from getting released. And when we move the sprocket lever, it causes this to hide inside so we can press the release shutter. So now let's assemble this back in so you know how it works. This is his little stud, the release lever's stud. And it's in just like that, leaning against this little tip of the sprocket lever so it doesn't go any further back. Next is its little cover with the narrower end facing upwards, just like that. Next we take this spring with the shorter end being on top and goes into this corner right here, just like the sprocket lever spring went into. It just goes right onto this stud over here. And now the long end has to go behind this lip over here, so when you try to pull it on, it's going to fly out again. So the best way to do it is put your finger on the stud here, so you're holding onto the spring, and then take the spring and lock it onto this lip over here. So now we got this assembled back, and we can play around with it, see how it works. Of course, when you're playing around with it, keep your finger on this stud because the springs will go flying. So as you see, when the sprocket goes and pulls on this lever, it will pull it and the whole locking mechanism will fall back down because that sprocket lever will come out from under it, so it won't have anything to lean on. So the spring will push it back against the rear wall there, right there. And the lock will come out from under the shutter release, allowing you to release the shutter. And when releasing the shutter, of course, keep your finger there. When releasing the shutter pushes this away from the wall, allowing the sprocket lock, the sprocket lever, point here, fall back under this locking lever, preventing it from going back against the rear wall all over again. So the lock is engaged, and when we flip the sprocket lever, now the lock is disengaged. It fell in against the rear wall, and now it's engaged again. So that's how the sprocket lever works with the release shutter lock. And here we got the battery assembly going right here, under here, goes all the way up to here, and over here it connects with this battery lever. Well, it's the shutter release lever that makes the connection with the batteries. When this goes down, it touches this battery contact, making a connection with this spring here firing the bulb, and the returning electricity to make, again, the connection with the battery up here connects with this entire, it's a metal part, so it conducts electricity, and with the help of this metal plate and this top screw here, connects to the other port of the battery. So again, the power flows, well, I don't know which way it flows first, but the connection goes from here along this to here. It gets touched by this when the release shutter gets pressed, flows by the help of this spring into the flash bulb, and from the flash bulb comes back out to the rear here, and with this contact it touches this part over here, and with the help of the frame goes to this screw over here that screws into this port, making a full circle back to the batteries. So that would be all with this camera here. Now let's get back to reassembling it. So now reassembly is the same way that we disassembled it. Easy to say, harder done, right? So we got this top plate, and this, of course, remembering that the shutter mechanism has to be cocked and returned back to its position. We just put it back on very delicately here, so we don't mess up everything here. And it is best, I notice, put your finger here, of course, and move the sprocket lever so the lock hides, because it has to, otherwise it would have to come physically out here, and that could make it harder to put it back in. So with the release lever lock back in against the rear wall, we should be able to just press it against the camera here, the rest of the body, and it should lower into its spot carefully. Careful for this spring over here as well. The locking lever now is leaning against the assembly here. So at this point, we can just move it out of the way by pressing on it for it to lock into position. Because now, careful of this spring, of course, we just put it, all right, there we go. I pressed the release shutter and that helped it. I just got to put it back into position here, and of course test everything out that it works, and make sure that the entire top plate here is back on to its alignment studs here and here. Yeah, so when the alignment studs are in place, that's how it should be. So you can test it all out. Wind the mechanism. Main lever is on this tip here on the lock, and the shutter lock is physically under the shutter release until we move the sprocket lever. Sprocket lever is moved, the shutter lock got disengaged. Now we can move the shutter again. All right, that's great, everything works. And of course you have to remember also about this spring here that we moved out of way. It has to come back on the other side of this little post over here to be right in this spot, and ideally it has to be under the shutter spring over here, right behind that shutter spring there. So when we cock it, move the sprocket lever, the lock is out. When we press the spring against the shutter here, it's going to cause it to open at 1/90th of a second, just like that. So everything works. At this point, we put the screws in, remembering, of course, that they were the silver springs over here. They can be a little harder to put in because they don't have a hole to go into. If you have a magnetic screwdriver, it's easier to put them in like that. So we got the top plate screwed in place. Cock it again, make sure everything works. Everything works just like it should. So test it often. So if something don't work, you don't have the whole camera to take apart all over again. Test this over here. Engages, drops. Open it up, lift it again. Every locking part works. So now we got to remember to put the spring back on the winding lever. Everything works. So let's put the spring back on. Of course, the spring goes, it's a little shape over here that you put it into this hole and it locks on, holding on nicely. So now we just pull it up and lock it into its stud over here and test everything again that it works. This works, the spring works, sprocket lever works, release lever works, everything works. So this part is good. Now we got the top part, remembering of course that we got this glass part that has to go over here in its holder, just like that. And then we put the top part in, of course, just like that. All nicely fits. Test everything, of course, before putting the screws in. All works. So now we put the two top screws back together. These screws have a hole to fall into, so they're easier to put inside. And I never tighten the screws too hard because it makes it easier for future to take them apart, because sometimes when somebody screws them in too hard, you can destroy the screws when taking them apart. And we return with this aluminum top plate. I guess it's aluminum, that's how it feels like. You can glue it together or not. I don't glue it because it does fall into place. Just make sure it's nicely straight when it falls into its place. Snaps into place. And it isn't too easy to take out by hand, so it shouldn't be falling off on its own. If it does bother you, you can put some not too strong glue underneath for future so you can take it apart just in case. And now we put on the front plate. Of course, remembering that we have to put the flash mechanism in here just from the top, making sure everything works here correctly as well. As you see, when it's out, that spring is against this golden part over here, and when we press it in, it engages this spring to lean against the shutter, just like that. And of course we won't see the rear mechanism here as you see here now. This spring over here goes along with this. So you can always bend the spring a little bit out so it touches it. It has a better contact there. And just make sure everything works here. All the springs are touching correctly. This spring is activating when the flash port is pushed down. Just like that. And this spring on the bottom here helps it pop out when you press on this lock, because when you close this spring over here engages this spring, falls under this plastic part and engages right here to prevent the flash from sliding out. So when you press on the flash release button here, this spring comes in, presses this spring down, so the flash can slide up this part over here. And the very tip over here, that's where this spring locks into, so the flash doesn't come flying out. The whole flash assembly don't come flying out. So having it all like this, we have to remember about the battery cover. There's many times I forgot about the battery cover and I had to take it apart all over again just to put in the battery cover back in. So, of course, with the open arrow pointing this way, we push the battery cover out here because it opens this way just like that, back and forth. And it locks up against this lip over here on the beginning of the cover. So open arrow direction goes towards the middle of this cover. So sitting in there, the whole cover just simply slides on to its place. Sometimes the battery cover does cause some problems, but shouldn't be causing too many problems. There we go. You could connect it a little bit lower down, slide it up, no, see, like me, the battery cover is causing some problems. So holding the entire frame together just help this battery cover get into its spot. Oh, there we go. Battery cover in its spot. Works, opens up, closes, and at this point you should see everything is nicely aligned, ready to get screwed on. Of course, remember the sides are the shorter screws. The shorter ones go into the sides here. Again, they don't have room to fall into anything, so they are harder to put in. So we could use our magnetic screwdriver to put in place. And the opposite side. And I thought we already lost the doors, but they just opened up. So they're not too tight in because we don't have this screw in yet, but let's put in this side screw now. There we go. And now this bottom screw. These bottom screws have some room to fall into. There we go. Now the doors shouldn't be flying around so loosely. They should be a little bit tighter in. Doors work. And now the final screw, the hard spot, is putting the final screw back in under the lens over here. And this little hole, the screw should fall into its spot in there. Just it's under an angle, so you have to hold the screw under an angle. There we go. The screw does fall into its hole over there. And then you just screw it in. You have to screw in the screw under an angle, so don't do it too hard because you can destroy the screw or something else. Just if it's in tight, it's in good. So we got this, the flash is pushed in. We hit the release lock for the flash. The bottom spring pushes it out a bit, and we take it up as high as it could go. That all works. The lock engages underneath here again. The flash doesn't come out by itself. We have to remember to keep this door opening lever up high so the door can press on inside when we mount this. Everything works. Now we can put the doors back on. So the doors, with this little cutout here, it goes into this hole over there. We just put that in there. Align the screw holes. And the screws got room to fall inside there, so they shouldn't be causing any problems. Just like that. And we tighten them inside. 1 and 2. And just like that, we got that done. We close the doors. The lock falls down. And everything is done. We need to open the doors. If you got a cartridge here with the proper film, you can test it with the cartridge in. If you don't, you can wind it, sprocket lever, and it should fire. It fires. Wind it, sprocket lever, shutter release. Everything works perfectly. So now, just for better presentation, I like to keep the flash socket out and have the bulb inside. And as we started it out, here's the bulb release lever. As you see, the connectors inside move open. When they're open, we just put the bulb in. Just like that, and the bulb stays in. And the camera is completely assembled and in perfectly working condition. So that's how you disassemble and reassemble the Kodak Instamatic 100 camera with everything working perfectly. So thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you do subscribe to see other cameras getting disassembled and reassembled and explained how everything works inside them, and other film photography related videos. And see you in the next video. Take care, my film photography friends.